Hello, and welcome to the first Real Estate and Technology Transformation Center virtual event. Thank you for joining us for today's RETTC on Air. Before we get started, I wanted to highlight a few administrative notes. All attendee lines are muted to ensure good sound quality. We anticipate this call to last 60 minutes, and this event will be recorded. There will be opportunities to ask questions throughout the course of the broadcast. Please feel free to submit your questions via the chat in the control panel on your screen. RETTC and NMHC staff are monitoring the submissions, and we will do our best to address all questions that come in. And lastly, I will direct you to our disclaimer and antitrust policy. RETTC provides general information to the public, and it is not intended to be investment, medical, or legal advice. RETTC's antitrust policy is designed to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. Antitrust laws prohibit activities that could result in an unreasonable restraint of trade. Therefore, please avoid discussing prices and pricing strategies and other topics that could impact prices, including discounts and promotions, wages, costs, market allocations, output reductions, or topics that discourage dealing with a specific provider or customer during any RETTC hosted event, whether formal or informal, held in person or virtually. Now I will turn this presentation over to NMHC's President, Sharon Wilson-Janot.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our very first RETTC webinar and virtual event. As you know, our work with the Real Estate Technology and Transformation Center really builds on the work that NMHC has done for many years. And we have now created RETTC as a partner organization to really amplify that work and be sure we're providing a pro-housing, pro-technology voice here in Washington, but also across the country. As you know better than I do, the time is now. It has never been more important for us to advocate for the housing that America needs and to talk about how important technology can be to creating more housing affordability, more housing choice, and more housing opportunity now and in the future. Today, in this first event, we're going to dig into RETTC's new update work on the MITS data model. As many of you will recall, NMHC worked very hard to create MITS back in 2003 as a way to help create more transparency for renters in comparing and understanding better the price structures for rental housing, and also to help us communicate better and use technology better in this space. I'm excited that we've been able to invest in the update for this work, and I know you'll really be interested, and hopefully this will be a very useful program for you. So with that, I will turn things over to our new Executive Director and Chief Advocacy Officer for RETTC, Kevin Donnelly, who will work you through the new product we have with the updated MITS. Kevin?
All right. Thank you, Sharon. We appreciate you being here with us. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us for what is an exciting launch of RETTC's virtual programming that will be built out throughout the year. A big thanks to Sharon and the leadership at NMHC for really helping us launch RETTC at this past year's OpTech conference, and really helping us build on the momentum and leadership of NMHC in the technology space over the past several years. So what I will do right now is just highlight some of what RETTC's body of work is. Many of you who were at OpTech with us last November, got a sneak peek at what really is the vision, which is being a platform where we can bring technology supplier partners and real estate owner operators and developers, along with some other key stakeholders to the table to speak with a pro-housing, pro-tech voice, really looking for ways that we can leverage technology to drive positive impact, not just in the rental communities that we operate, but also in the daily lives of our renters and their experiences. So if we could, Glenn, just move through some of the slides. The vision really is to seize the moment and really help communities achieve greater housing affordability. through the transformative power of tech. We all see it on a daily basis, certainly at NMHC and now at RETTC. And it's something that we've been really proud to build on. Um, again, just amplifying what Sharon said is RETTC is a new membership organization strategically aligned with NMHC, and we're really building off of that legacy of leadership in this space. We do believe that RETTC will ultimately enable rental housing stakeholders of all kinds to drive smarter business decisions, really to improve not just the bottom line, but improve the resident experience and outcomes that we also strive for. And Glenn, if we can move to the next one. Our vision really is that, again, building off of the community that NMHC has built for so long, really providing a dedicated resource, dedicated bandwidth, dedicated staff to the technology space at NMHC and at RETTC. So really at the intersection between prop tech and investors, the top real estate firms across the country, we're really excited to see this community take shape. And over the next several months, we will be continuing to roll out new features or planks of work from RETTC. Again, really leading to our flagship and marquee conference, the OpTech conference that'll be back in Vegas this year. And then, of course, many of you have heard and sent in inquiries. RETTC will be launching an inaugural Spring Tech and Data Summit for leadership. It's really an attempt by RETTC to have a more curated experience for owner operators and developers of rental housing, as well as bring in some top tier supplier partners across the industry. And Glenn, if we can move to the next. This, I just want to highlight quickly, while so much of the work that the MITS data model updates related to fee transparency embody the mission and vision of RETTC, we are clearly looking across the technology landscape and across what rental housing operators face on a day-to-day basis as they look to serve their residents. So one key plank of our work is focused on connectivity, really the backbone of multifamily. So what we've put forward in partnership with Dom Beveridge at 20 for 20 is a public resource about the state of multifamily connectivity, a really great landscape review and resource for the industry. And so we've decided to make this publicly available, so you can feel free to download your copy here using the QR code. But this is just another example of the resources that we hope to be able to provide to the marketplace. So definitely stay tuned. And with that, I'm going to now turn it over to Lori Reeves, who's the senior advisor for RETTC, and she's done so much of the good work here on MITS. So a huge thanks to her and the work group members, our chair, Michael Berry, and the like. So I'm going to turn to Lori, and she's going to walk us through the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad you joined us today. So our agenda for today is to talk about the impetus for this initiative, which is a data model, and talk about how the data model was developed, what are the contents of the data model, and how does an organization implement the data model. And then we'll just do a little bit of talking about what's next. So if you go to the next slide, Glenn, I would like to introduce Ian Cameron with OSCRE International, who is going to be our panel moderator for today.
Thank you very much, Lori and Kevin and Sharon. We're very excited to be here today. There's some tremendous work being done, effectively led by the folks on our panel today. So, Lori, thank you for your leadership in this effort. We're loving every minute of our collaboration. My name is Ian Cameron, Chief Innovation Officer from OSCRE. I've had the pleasure of working with Michael Barry, the VP for Data Analytics at Bozzuto. And Michael is part of a working group that, Lori, you're going to talk a bit more about in a little while, about the other companies that worked with Michael in that capacity. In the project team, it was a collaboration of RETTC and the working group, and Tyler Christensen and his team at Cherre. Tyler is the head of industry solutions over there. Tyler, thank you for all the good work that you have brought to this project. And OSCRE's technical director, Chris Lees, who was heavily into the specifics of the data model and you'll be hearing also from him around implementation steps. So, Laurie, and Michael, I'd like to go to the next slide, please, and have you talk quickly about the impetus for the project and work off the charter.
Sure, I'll start and then Michael can chime in. So what we did was we had a working group formed to update MITS, and specifically we focused on the property marketing ILS version for fee transparency. And as part of the working group, we had suppliers and owner operators come together to work on a solution, and we drafted this project charter, which guided us. Michael, I guess if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, thanks, Lori, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I think, a major driver of the initiative was, of course, around facilitating and enabling higher degree of data sharing between platforms. And it was also looking at MITS as a vehicle for ensuring that all the technology solutions that support our industry continue to remain on the cutting edge, are modernized. The tech ecosystem has, evolved greatly since, the origin of MITS as a data standard. So being able to leverage this data model as a tool to support that growth, I think was a big driver as well. And I think that was reflected by the participation, the depth and breadth of companies and everybody's engagement throughout the process. I think that was the most encouraging and best part about the whole initiative from the beginning was it was a very demanding schedule, but all the participants really rose up and gave a lot of great feedback, and we came out with a better product for that. And we want to build off of that going into the future.
Thank you both very much. And Glenn, if you'd bump us to the next slide, please. The design goals on the screen, we're going to, Michael, come back to you and talk about the operator, and Chris, you'll chime in towards the bottom end of this list. But these were very important to us as we got the project going. So Michael, if you could just cover the top end of this to just characterize what we were trying to achieve.
Yeah, so in the early, one of our early steps was looking at the existing property marketing module of MITS and looking at what components of the existing model allowed for the identification of charges, and looked and wanted to create a more flexible methodology, a method and design within the data model to facilitate a broader swath of charges. So one of our early goals was to look at what are the types of charges that are in place and in use across the industry, across the participants within the work group. And when we looked at that, there was a lot of commonality, but variety in the details. And that variety is built off of a lot of legacy systems. We're not starting from scratch. We're operating companies that have existing ledgers, existing solutions in place, and certainly charge codes that are already being utilized on site. So there's a lot of data already in place in these systems. So when we looked at how can we bridge to the future and say there's all these different charge codes, but a lot of commonalities and threads, and we'll see that within the class structure in one of the later slides. But we wanted to build within the data model a means to allow operators to map their existing charges to a common shared set of classes. So there is this consistency of language and terminology, which then facilitates transparency, greater transparency and clarity for end users, but also build it in a way that it didn't create a it would not be a major implementation overhaul of existing ledger structures and have operators map all their existing charge codes to new charge codes, change training processes, et cetera. So I think we've come to a really good stepping point into the future where the classes will allow us to allow operators to take what they have in place and make sure that that data can be transmitted through the MITS data model in a way that can be understood by other platforms and create that transparency.
Yeah, I think that's great, Michael. And I remember when we first spoke back in September, I think it was, you shared that list of somewhere over 1,200 different charges. And I mean, there's so much duplication of things that were just confusingly similar but different. So yeah, great progress for sure. And I think the other thing is that I appreciate there's probably some people listening today who are quite familiar with MITS, and I mean, MITS has been around a long time now. It's not a new thing. And it's probably worth saying, particularly for those who have engaged with previous versions of the MITS data models and the documentation that's been published over the years, that we've not, this has not been a fundamental shift and change. So we've retained a lot of the structure and content that was there in the past, including this hierarchy, the property phase, building, floor plan, and unit hierarchy. And all we've done is really strengthen the way in which fees can be expressed at all of those levels, so that, as Michael was alluding to, we can reach for that consistency and still limit, the potential duplication. So you can say that this is a fee, it applies to everything in the property, or it applies to everything on a particular floor plan, or it might be specific to a particular unit. But all of those different levels are still there, just as they were before. We've just strengthened the ability to express fees at each of those levels.
Thank you, Chris. Glenn. So we'd like to cut across the panel and have you comment on why is this data model so important, and then also to make sure that we're focusing on consumers and renters. So Laurie, and Michael, I wonder if you could pick up the first one on the left there, thinking about the consumers and the rentals. Why is this so important to them?
Sure. Well, since the data model that's been updated includes fee classifications that support transparency in the costs associated with renting an apartment or renting a home, consumers will be able to understand these costs much sooner in the process. So they'll be aware of them before they select an apartment, where in some cases in the past, it wasn't until they got to signing lease documents that they really were made aware of all of these fees. So I think that's a big win for the consumers.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely, Lori. I think another area that came up through the discussions was to, again, back to the idea of modernization, creating seamlessness between platforms. I think it's clear within the multifamily space, there's multiple solutions that are in place, certainly through the early leasing and search process with ILS partners, but trying to lay the foundation for how data can be consistent throughout the leasing process to really improve the experience of the consumer from the beginning of their relationship when they're searching to throughout their residency and then move out, et cetera. So we were focused on the property and marketing component, but I think that came out through a lot of the discussions with the work group was being able to think about a longer term vision of how the data model will be able to continue to support seamless experience across all the technology solutions that we depend upon.
Thank you, Laurie and Michael. Tyler, if you could just pick up this same question for the listing services and software providers.
Sure. So when I think about this from a technology perspective, part of the reason that data models are important is because it creates a common language across all of the systems and technologies that are going to help be part of that resident journey. This isn't isolated to, oh, like somebody looks for an apartment and then they're done, right? Like the information that's presented to them and what they see is going to be pervasive throughout that journey. And if there's a constant need for translation, right? Every time you translate, there's a little bit of interpretation involved. There's this constant need for translation. Instead of creating trust and transparency in the journey, you create a little bit of confusion and you start to obfuscate certain things. So by creating that common language and have all of the systems speaking the same language as the resident moves through the resident journey and you remove those layers of interpretation, ultimately what ends up happening is you build a relationship between the housing provider and the residents that's based on transparency and trust.
And Chris, since OSCRE has a focus around data models in general and data modeling and use thereof, what's your perspective on these questions?
We'll talk as we get into implementation about some of the specifics here, but data modeling, I mean, we've certainly seen it, particularly over the last 5 years, that having effective data models is really right up there on the agenda of most organizations now. It was, it was fashionable perhaps 30 years ago, and then it suddenly disappeared for some reason. But people are realizing now, data requirements are business requirements. People are really getting that message. And having these data models supports us in so many ways. There's lots of different ways in which we can use them, whether it's integrating systems, producing kind of service interfaces just like ILSs, right? Or internal data modeling and procurement activities. There's a lot that we do here that having a data model actually will support us with.
Good, thank you, Chris. And I wanted to acknowledge Carla that we see your question in chat. There's a place for it further down the agenda. So thanks for putting those in the chat. Laurie.
Okay. Next slide, please. So the data model, as I mentioned earlier, we formed a working group and we had such great participation. I really want to thank all of these companies for their dedication and hard work. So really, we had obviously NMHC, RETTC, OSCRE, and Cherre are partners in this. Michael, Barry, and Bazzuto as the chair of the working group, and all these companies that attended weekly workshops with very focused work. It's really a remarkable testament to how the stakeholders in this industry can come together and quickly produce results that benefit all. So I really just wanted to thank everyone for their participation.
Thank you, Laurie. The approach that we took to this was to start out with a series of workshops. And if you scan those 4 columns there, left to right, you'll see a general progression from conceptual data modeling and the business case to the more detailed data dictionary for the fee classifications, et cetera, and schemas. And then we went into the Optic conference in October. Following that, there was an industry review before we published and got ready for today. But Glenn, if you could skip to the next slide, there's a couple of things, Chris, I wonder if you might pick up, because it led to some very rich content once we were done with this. So Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Ian said, that those September, October workshops really led us to understanding what the data model probably should be. But of course, it's not good enough just to have an idea what it probably should be. So we then went into this phase, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, of firstly formalizing the model, so documenting it, producing some of the specifications that we'll come to in a moment. But also at that time, what we did, and this was based on fantastic feedback and contributions from the work group and a lot of hard graft by Michael, I have to say, so thank you, Michael. We produced some detailed test cases. And these were test cases that, for the very most part, were simply not possible in the older versions of MITS. 1 or 2 of them you could have done, but most of them took advantage of the more sophisticated ability to describe these fees and charges. but they also really pushed at the boundaries. These were many of them were common but complex. Some of them were really quite edge cases, but we wanted to make sure that the model was as robust as possible. And then we published those test cases, and we published example files as part of an industry consultation. So people could not only see the specifications, they could also look at examples of what that would really look like in practice and understand how the test cases that we had, there were 15 or so sets of test cases looking at different areas, see how those test cases would actually show up in the new, at that stage, proposed data model. And we got some, great engagement during that, some really interesting questions asked. And that led us up to that point at the end of December there, where we were able to finalize all of the documentation and publish. So yeah, a really valuable part of this. And it's given us these testing artifacts, these test cases, which are going to be really valuable, hopefully, to everybody who's trying to implement this new data model.
Good. Thank you, Chris. So let's get into the contents. And Chris, I'm going to come back to you just to give us a quick summary, Glenn, of the actual deliverables that came out that you will have access to. So next slide, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a range of deliverables here, and they're really targeting, for the most part, slightly different audiences. So there's some documentation that is very much designed to help orient you on what the data model is, how you might use it, why it exists. So some of the stuff that you've heard us talking about already, and really explaining what is this new approach to fees, this idea of classes, items, and amounts. And then we have a range of things that support that. So I already mentioned those test cases, both the actual documentation of the test case and also the example XML files containing the data in the model. But we've also provided the schema updates. So those more technical of you perhaps looked at the previous version 4.1. So we've updated that and produced version 5. And those schemas are helpful. They can be used to partially pre-configure software, of course. They can also be used to test the validity of files. So that's very useful. And then there's some other documentation that you'll find published on the site that Laurie referred you to earlier. But all of that really is a package to try and make this as easy as possible for you all to adopt.
Thank you very much, Chris. Michael, I'm going to come to you first now to start walking us through the classifications themselves. And Chris and Michael, I encourage you to talk these through together.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. So as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, some of the early work we saw was there's a lot of variety within the details of charges, but equally, a lot of consistency. Operations across the industry, cover a lot of the same types of charges. So the idea of the charge classes here is that we create this common industry-wide, terminology that can then be leveraged across different platforms, particularly ILSs, but also in PMSs, property management systems, where existing charge codes can continue to remain in place. There's legacy reporting built off of that. There's internal data reporting needs. There's many special cases, depending on the type of property, the location, et cetera, where operator-specific charges have to be utilized. So the classes provided a means for operators to map their existing chart of charges to these classes. So then when it's transmitted and then utilized within ILSs, it can create some of that shared understanding around what a charge pertains to. So like an example, if you have an application fee and your charge code is called app fee, it can be mapped to the application charge class here. And that's understood. This is the app fee within this operator, is an application fee. But the existing operator system can remain in place without needing a large migration or data conversion or anything of that sort. So that was the idea of the classes. And then it also builds upon one of the other tenets of the goal of the group when we were looking at the data model was, transparency means part of it is that there's, the consumer or the resident, when they see their ledger and when they're actually, become a resident, what they saw at the point of the ILS when they were searching, or wherever they saw, were doing their search, it would, match with what they would see as their actual set of charges when they're, occupying a unit at the property. So being able to facilitate the existing set of charge codes was one of the early kind of decision points of the work group, and then leveraging the classes to create commonality. So, within the details of the data model, and we'll kind of in the next slide, we'll get into that, but within the charge offer, it has ability to transmit not just the class. So the class does not become the only piece of information that it would be within the data model that's transmitted. It would also have the specific charge code, the code itself and any description that would be used to display to the consumer along within the other attributes of the charge. So I think then that kind of leads to, if you want to move to the next slide, the charge offer class. Chris, do you want to kind of talk?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was great what you were saying about the classes, and I'll repeat something you said again because I think it's so important, which is those classes are not about replacing those existing fee codes. Those fee codes stay. Those classes are really, I always think of them in a way as a layer above that allows them to be grouped together in a consistent way across the industry. But as Michael said, that kind of brings into this kind of three-layered model. So at the top, you have the idea of the class. And, the class, as Michael says, groups them. But it also allows us, it gives us a place to add a bit of additional context, and particularly some kind of constraints and limits. So, for example, it's at the class level oftentimes that you can do the more sophisticated limitation, like, in this building, you can have no more than one large dog and 3 pets in total, and the total pet fees are capped at $100. Those kinds of things are expressed at the class level because that's all about pet. And then below that, we get the individual items. And so this is probably the existing fee codes that you already have, right? So this is things like the large dog deposit, or it's the pet screening fee. And there will typically be many of or several of these in each of the classes that you're using. And you can also, at the item level, you can define some of the really important characteristics of the item. So you can talk about things like payment frequency, the circumstances in which the fee might be refundable. When in the life cycle is it going to be paid? Michael talks about application fees. Well, that's a particular point in the life cycle. And also then individual item limits and how the amounts are actually going to be calculated. And also dependencies, things like if you've said you've got a pet, then it's not just the pet fee you've got to also have pet screening. So there's a relationship there between two fees that can be described. And then finally at the bottom, we've got these offer amounts, which are where you get into the actual monetary amounts and also what term they apply for, if not the whole lease. So this kind of approach gives us that.
Yeah, no, sorry, Chris. I think one thing just to add to that, we didn't want the data model to get in the way of flexibility of data sharing and being able to transmit data. So I think the charge offer, this approach was a really elegant way to create that flexibility where operators can, depending on the specific sets of charges they need to transmit, they can transmit that number, those types. So I think there's a lot of flexibility within the model that's can be really supportive of ongoing growth. I think that's where we've seen in the past where the model is too, if it's too restrictive, it creates hurdles for implementation.
And that's perhaps one of the big differences, isn't it, Michael? Is that there's so much more flexibility here to really describe what these charges and fees are about.
Yep.
Well, thank you both. Let's just keep this on the screen. If you could back up for a moment, please, Glenn. Thank you. There's some really good questions in the chat. And I don't know, Chris and Michael, if you can see those, but let's start out with kind of a detailed one from Matri Johnson. Do the new classes of charge include background screening fees?
Yeah, I would say certainly. So if that's, that's that idea of the classes, if that's something that would be categorized, depending on the particular use case, but you have say just background screening fee, and that's an admin fee, that can be mapped to the admin charge class, and then all the details of that particular charge or fee, can also be transmitted. So if it needs to be called background screening fee, so when it's displayed, that would be transmitted within the data model for display to the consumer.
And it's probably worth adding to that, Michael, that although we just showed the list of classes, obviously each of those classes does have a narrative description to help you understand what would sit in each class.
Right.
And we also recognize, that there's always going to be some edge cases. There'll be some things that, one organization might classify as one class, another might put it in a different class. Our goal here wasn't to be absolutely 100% completely no variation, everything will be perfect, because that is clearly unrealistic in all walks of life, but rather that we can just really raise the bar on consistency, get somewhere near, great, as opposed to where it is at the moment, which is quite a lot of inconsistency.
Yeah. And back to that, not having the data model be a prohibitor, right? Like to have it, the data model should support any type of charge being transmitted and then read in by the receiving system to the, and I think that's a key part of this in the work to this on the next steps in implementation is like data that's charges and data that comes through within a data file, it needs to be, displayed in the listing.
Yeah, and I see, Ian, there's another question in there about time.
There is, and Carla, thank you. There's a couple of good ones in here. Chris, you want to field them?
Well, I was going to let Michael deal with. I'll let Michael deal with Carla's first questions. I'll come to the timing one. So yeah, there's in our classifications, particularly of the items when we're laying out these characteristics, there's a lot of information in there now about timing. So you can talk about the periodicity of a fee. So is it something that essentially accrues on a daily basis or a monthly basis, or whatever it is? There's like 12 options, starting from hourly, going all the way out to annually. There's also then information about the payment frequency. So even though it might accrue perhaps on an hourly or a daily basis, you might still only pay it monthly. So you can describe all of that. And then there's also a lot of information about the requirement for the fee. So we can describe fees that are mandatory. And I think Michael will pick this up, I'm sure, in the TMLP question you've raised. But it will, we can say this fee is mandatory, payable in all circumstances, but we can also say it might be situational. So it's going to be charged sometimes. So for example, damage charges. It could also be optional, right? So this is what it costs, but it's up to you whether you take advantage of this or not. So it's up to you, in other words, whether you end up paying that fee. And as I mentioned earlier, it could also be conditional. So this fee might become mandatory if something else is the case. I must pay pet screening if I have pets. So you can describe all of those cases. And we've also actually included the ability for you to say, there is no fee for this because this is included. That you might cover that in amenities as well, and that's okay. But for things that might, you might want to be quite explicit about the fact that perhaps others charge for this, but we don't, you can describe it as included. Michael, do you want to pick up that TMLP question that Carla has?
Yeah, no, I think a really good question. And it, speaks to a lot of the work that I'm really happy about what we built into the data model. And, Chris and the OSCRE team and the work group, helped craft this. I think we have a good method within the data model that creates, again, back to that idea of that shared language, shared, consistent interpretation of the data. One of our major goals was building a consistent way to interpret the amounts and to facilitate exactly which the question's getting at here, Carla, is the total monthly leasing price. So we wanted to, the data model has, we think we've captured those different characteristics of a charge, in terms of the frequency, the timing, the amount, the frequency, the timing, amongst others. How could a system, without any other input other than the data being transmitted itself, come up with consistent calculations of cost? And I think a lot of the platforms, through work, discussions within the work group and tools, what we've seen within various platforms, that's where those capabilities are being developed. There's so the idea of a total monthly leasing price and pricing calculators is going to be capabilities that are being built into these different platforms, and the data model should have the data that's needed to populate into those calculators. So
Good, thank you, Michael. So Glenn, I wonder, Laurie, if you could just quickly talk about how to get to the materials.
In the
So-
essence of time, I will go through this quickly, but if you go to RETTC.org, and across the top navigation is the MITS webpage, and there you'll find along the right hand the published data standard in the new version 5.0 data models. And really, there's a lot there. So if you download the supporting documentation, there is a PDF PowerPoint that walks you through the entire data model, explains everything in detail. All the test case are there. The testing results are there. A diagram is there. Of course, the technical XSD and a searchable data dictionary. So that's how you get to it. And hopefully you'll all go take a look at some of that.
Thank you, Laurie. So we're going to touch now on implementation, and we're going to cut across the panel, and we'll pick up Kevin's and Carla's questions in this segment. So let's just walk through what implementation actually means. And I think in there, Kevin will let Tyler answer your question, but Michael, Kevin is thinking about the PMS and ILS vendors too. But let's start with you from your perspective. How would you approach implementation using the new data model?
yeah, so just to speak to Kevin's question real quickly, the partners, PMS partners and ILS partners in that slide earlier, we have really broad engagement and strong engagement from many of the major platforms within the industry. So I think they're very much engaged. They're proactive in adoption and moving in this direction. So I think that's great to work across all that and have all that input. It's critical to getting to the end state. So in terms of implementation, I think areas to start looking at, of course, working, owners should be communicating with their technology partners and, start looking at, how is it being implemented within their solutions, within their platforms. That's, can engage in that conversation intentionally and specifically around this and charge codes and the new MITS standard. And then looking internally at your charge codes, I think, given the classes that were implemented and your existing set of charges as an owner operator, how, and the descriptions of those classes, how should you be mapping your existing charges? I think that kind of speaks to Carla's next question. Carla, lots of good questions, Carla, today. accuracy and effectiveness of your charges, I think it's a good opportunity to look at existing charges and see where there's opportunities to build consistency between properties in a portfolio. Are the types of charges being utilized the same? Is there areas to consolidate, et cetera? Are all good opportunities to be thinking about how to implement to the new data model.
Thank you, Michael and Tyler and Chris. We've just got a few minutes here to allow Laurie to close for us. So Tyler, let me come to you. Hold it, please. We're not there yet. So Tyler, if you just please cover the ILS and PMS providers.
Sure. From a technology perspective, in terms of implementing the data model, now that that data model has been defined and exists, various, like all the PMS providers have been engaged. They're starting to become aware of it. Now that there's a thing to do, this is work that can be done. But I very much echo Michael's sentiment on, like, from a technology perspective, we can provide the containers, right? We can say, hey, the bucket is shaped like this, the mold is shaped like this. But it's really up to the housing providers as to like how they're going to fill that and what's the quality of the information that they're going to fill that with. So we can certainly provide the structure, but the data that will fill that structure is still going to be incumbent on the housing providers. And Carla, you're 100% right when you say, hey, like, doesn't this involve like ongoing administration of the PMS system and things like that? Data is a discipline, right? Like going and mapping your charge codes once, putting the new data model in place, like that is the beginning of the journey. But data is an ongoing discipline if you want to continue to drive transparency in the industry, if you want to continue to have that high quality of data, whether it's for powering the resident journey, internal analytics, other things you want to do with it, like all of that comes back to like the discipline and the governance that you wrap around these transformational pieces.
Good, thank you. And just a final moment there, Chris, from a data modeling perspective.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Tyler said there. One thing that will happen, of course, with having the data model in play and it being adopted is that poor data quality will become more obvious, of course. So it kind of helps by catching more because it improves transparency and visibility. In terms of implementation, though, I would say that there's a couple of perspectives. Think about the different kinds of projects where you have an opportunity to implement, right? So you could be integrating a couple of systems that might be strategic or tactical just to automate. You might be producing a service interface. So ILS, a classic example of that. The service interface is going to be used by many. Obviously, opportunity to use these data models there. You could be looking more internally and looking at your own enterprise data model. And as Tyler says, data is a discipline. And enterprise data modeling is becoming more and more common, and using these industry data models is very powerful in supporting that work. It saves a lot of time and it helps you benefit from the thinking across the industry. And of course, procurement. Whenever you're in the market for software or services, you can start asking for compliance with these data models or conformance to these schemas. And when you're going through any kind of project, you need to be thinking right from the beginning when you're identifying an opportunity to take advantage of the data model. Think about all the different projects that might affect, all the way through making a business case, looking at alignments. Like, it's really interesting to see how aligned your data already is to these industry data models. Because where they're not aligned, that could well be an opportunity for you to learn something from the industry and maybe improve the way you're currently operating. And if what you're doing is actually better than what's in the data models, then feed it back. Laurie and Kevin and the team will be really keen to hear for feedback to inform the roadmap that they are, working on. And you've got to think about this all the way through, right through to the ongoing maintenance. Once you've built and used these, as you've heard, these data models will evolve to support evolving needs and to become of even greater value. So you need to think about the fact that evolution is going to take place, and be ready to evolve your use of these data models alongside.
Thank you, Chris. And there's a couple of questions. Jack Miller pointed out that the folks online can't see the questions, but Laurie, let's move to you to bring us to a close on next steps and a wrap up. and maybe there's an opportunity to
Sure.
address some of those questions remaining.
I did take myself off mute. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we formed a working group, the MITS working group. And while that was a very heavy commitment with weekly workshops, we are going to a much more bearable cadence of once a month. So we look forward to anybody. MITS is open to all. If you would like to join us and help form the next updates, we welcome your participation. We look to modernize the rest of the whole technical architecture, I guess, of the MITS data model. And that's work that RETTC will be doing and completely aligns with the mission of RETTC of making technology a force for good. So if you're interested in joining, you can email mits@retc.org. You can go to our webpage and show us your interest there. There's lots of ways to find us. We're just waiting to hear from you. Okay.
Great. And I'll just jump in there. Thank you,
Want to
Lori.
jump in? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think, like NMHC's commitment to the MITS data models in the past, RETTC is fully committed to making sure that the architecture and the data models are of utility to the industry. So we're going to be taking a holistic view of what needs to be done, working with Michael and the team and the work group members really to make sure it meets the moment. So much more to come as RETTC builds out its program of work. And I know we're getting a lot of questions in the chat about ILS and PMS integrations. Who's going to roll this in? I don't think that we have a list yet. But I think if you look at who was participatory in the work group, we had quite a diverse group. Everyone from the big PMS players to essentially the larger or any well-known ILS providers in our space participating. So I think the endpoint for us is that we expect it to be widely adopted like MITS was. And I think while it remains a voluntary data model, we do think it meets the moment importantly to really serve both housing providers, tech partners, and our residents.
Well, with that, Kevin and Laurie, are there any questions you'd still like to field? Otherwise, I think we may have a wrap.
Tyler, I don't know if you wanted to talk about some of the tools. So we continue to work on tools to help you implement this. And Tyler's company is working on a nice mapping tool.
Yeah, so on the Cherre side, one of the bits of tooling that we're rolling out that'll be available to NMHC members and through the RETTC website is an initial mapping tool to take all of those charge codes that you might have in your PMS system and map them to the charge offer classifications. Really an accelerator in helping you get started on this journey, right? Some of you folks have been on these PMS systems for maybe like 15 years, 20 years. And depending on, how much you've learned over that time, you may have hundreds or even thousands of charge codes that are in use, and going through and mapping that manually would be an absolutely brutal task. So we're going to bring some tools to bear and help apply some technology to accelerate that. And this is also something that, as we think about where this goes going forward, is something that you'll be able to leverage to help stay in compliance and stay aligned with the MITS standard as it continues to evolve.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Ian, thank you for helping lead today's conversation.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here before we wrap to, of course, thank the one and only Lori Reeves for all of this incredible work. But alongside of Lori has been an incredible brain trust from the team at Cherre, the team at OSCRE. Huge thanks on behalf of all the different stakeholders. Really, really important work that's been done. Again, RETTC is a big tent, tech supplier partners, housing providers, a number of different stakeholders across the landscape, and we encourage you to join us in our work. This is just one small sample of all that RETTC will be doing alongside of these important folks. So do reach out to us. Many of us will be on site next week at NMHC annual meeting in Vegas. And of course, working throughout the year to serve the industry. So thank you again for being here with us today for our first virtual RETTC program. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we appreciate if you would complete that and provide your feedback. With that, thank you for attending this broadcast. Please feel free to reach out to any of us for more information. Have a great day.